Okay, how many people attended my talk on Friday at the Django conference? Okay, please don't attend this talk. Because I'm going to pretty much be covering the same ground, so you're going to see a lot of the same slides. It was a 2-for-1 deal. They asked me to do the Django thing, and I said as long as I can kind of make them similar. So we've got the big gay adventure over that way, which, you know, these are my pictures, not theirs, and this is scientific visualization, I think. Simulation. So do attend this talk if you want to know when to use a CMS and when not to use a CMS, when to use a framework, and a little bit at the end about how to combine both. So I want to apologize in advance because last night I drank a couple of these on top of all the rest of it, so I've got a massive hangover, or I did this morning. So if this isn't done as well as it could be, I'm blaming the Tasmanian Long Island iced tea. So this is me. This is what I look like when I'm presenting. It's a lot like this. So a little bit of history about me. I'm a Plone core contributor. That was for the Django slide, but it's still true. I've never written a line of Django. I have done Pyramid. And I've also been around the blocks with regard to sort of web development and development in general. I used to be a Java developer, which is not written there, like a lot of people. Built a lot of websites with my company since then. The other thing I want to talk about is that I kind of lied a little bit. I said I was going to have a showdown. It's less, you're not going to see a scorecard, there's not going to be a winner, there's not going to be like blood on the floor or anything like that. What I really want to talk about is how many people here are framework kind of people, like a Django, Pyramid, something like that? Sort of? How many people are CMS kind of people would consider themselves building websites using CMS? Okay. So hopefully what I'm going to leave you with is an understanding of what the difference is, because I think a lot of people can get quite confused and end up doing the wrong, using the wrong tool for the wrong job. So a little bit about, you know, what frameworks are out there and sort of where their influences come from. We had some I'll just open this right up. One of the first frameworks, I think Twisted counts as framework. I haven't got that on there, but Zope is one of the first big popular Python frameworks that a lot of people wouldn't know about, and it goes all the way back to 1996, and it does work in a slightly different way, which I talked about in my other talk, which I'm not going to talk about here. But yeah, after about 2004, you had this massive explosion of routing-based frameworks, and that's where the kind of real rise of a lightish weight framework came about. And Django is by far the most popular Python framework. Flask is probably these days second. It seems to be gaining in popularity quite a bit. It's what they call a micro framework. Pyramid is moderately popular. I tried to actually look at the statistics. Someone asked me this the other day, like how many Plone sites are out there versus how many Django sites. I'm not sure how you work out how many Django sites. If you go use a tool like BuiltWith, it tries to analyze lots of technologies that are used in different sites, and all it has is some statistics on the Django cross-site scripting integration. So, and I'm not 100% sure if all Django sites have that, so it's probably not a good indication. So the extra one is there's this other area of frameworks, which are these static site generations, and they're also becoming quite popular. I didn't put it here, but Sphinx is an example. Who's used Sphinx here? Sphinx is pretty cool. Like the whole idea of a static site generator is that you write in restructured text or Markdown or maybe HTML, and then you use Python on the command line to generate something and then push it to a web server. So there's nothing dynamic about it. It's not a dynamic framework. So Nickel is an example of that. So CMS is by far the most popular CMS by a long margin is WordPress. So this is percentage of the total CMS market, as in websites that can be identified as having using a CMS. I think it's something around 30%, or like there's a good chunk of the total websites in the world which are written in WordPress. So it's in some ways a good reason not to use WordPress, because it's very well targeted for people trying to hack it. Doesn't help that it's written on PHP, so it's slightly easier. Second is Joomla, but Joomla seems to be declining a little bit, and Drupal seems to be increasing. So this shows them roughly equal, but it depends a lot on whether you're looking at the sort of the 10K versus 100K versus the top million. So Drupal tends to get used for bigger sites. So what is a CMS? It seems like a silly question, but I think that not everyone is as familiar about what a CMS is. And in fact, in some communities, there's a lot of debate, about what a CMS is. So on one hand, it's an app. Like it's something that you build, and it's an app designed, built by someone else that you can download and use off the bat. Hopefully not built by you. I once gave a talk on, I went to what do you call those things? An unconference once, and someone had a talk on why to build your own CMS. So I wrote a talk in the lunch and did it afterwards on why not to build your own CMS. That lets, the whole idea of the app is letting people edit content and having a separation between content and design. Another way to think of a CMS is as a big framework. Some CMSs are more frameworky than others, but generally they've got, this is just a feature list I pulled off some site, but they do an awful lot of things, and they have an awful lot of features, and and a lot of these things have APIs, and you have to understand how you want to customize them, because at the end of the day you're going to be building a site, and you might want some of these things or not want some of these things, and you're going to have to know all those frameworks and all those APIs and how to get rid of things or change them to what you want. So I know the most about Plone. So I'll use Plone as an example of a CMS. So for those who don't know, it's quite a large project that's still quite popular. It tends to get used in the big end of town, so it has a good reputation for security. It's open source. It's not founded by one particular company. It's very much a democratic kind of community, a bit like Django. And it has a really good name for security, which is partly why the FBI use it as their main public site among lots of governments around the world. So I was just gonna, I've lost where my, so for those who haven't seen a CMS, anyone not seen what a CMS looks like when you get it out of the box? No? The idea is that instead of getting a blank sheet of paper, like a blank page like you would say with a framework, you get something that has the ability, has navigation, maybe has search, has the ability just to click edit. So you've got something you can instantly use. Plone includes things like workflow, so you can have it submitted and have it reviewed. Has a workflow editor, which is a little bit different than some others. And another big thing about a CMS is this idea of theming. So instead of using templates and having, what you want to do is you want to have the content editors edit the content using that interface, and then you have theming being done by another set of people. So if I activate this theme, for instance, then suddenly the whole interface changes and how people see it is different. And a lot of what you're doing as someone who's building CMSs or building CMS-based websites for other people is doing customization, creating themes, getting it to look like a certain design, or being an integrator and bringing in different plugins. So here's, say, a bunch of add-ons. Some are theme related, some of them, dexterity content types, for instance. We can see that down here. Where was the content types? Content types are quite a common CMS thing. It's the idea that, well, you've got different kinds of content in your system and you want to add different fields and you want to give them, you know, their different sorts of types and so on. So that's a demo of a CMS. So that means I can skip through all of this. Oh, and some CMSs are SaaS-based. You know, you can, like WordPress.com, for instance. So Plone, for instance, you can go to ploud.com and just get an instant Plone site. You can use that theme editor. You can edit it through the web and create your own very customized website. Drupal Gardens is a similar sort of thing with less flexibility in terms of theming. That's how the theming works. So Django-based CMSs. There's Mezzanine, there's Django CMS. Is there any other ones that people have used? Nope. So this was a little bit about, you know, well, what's the difference between a simple CMS versus a complex CMS? There's all sorts of different features that you might have. And these are some of the things that Plone has that Django CMS didn't seem to have, but it's not that important. That's roughly the same sort of thing. So one of the questions I want to cover is, like, how do you know? It seems like, again, a silly question. How do you know you're making an app? Like, sometimes it's a little bit murky, right? And it's like, yeah, there's content in the site. So maybe a CMS is the right thing. And I don't want to have to, like, you know, hand code the HTML content myself. So yeah, CMS seems like a good idea. One of the things I think that should indicate that you're making an app is where you have wireframes. So this is actually an app we built this year for the New South Wales Pools Registry, and these are all the different screens and all the workflows and stuff. It's not an information architecture, it's actually a workflow of how do you get information through the system and what forms there are. If you're making workflows like wireframes like this, then where you're placing buttons and you've got, you know, entering forms, etc., that's a really good indication that you're building an app. You want that level of customization. This is, by the way, a really cool tool called Go Mockingbird. Has anyone used Balsamiq? It's another wireframing tool. I think it's a little bit better because it's HTML based and you can collaborate and you can share links and stuff, and it's also more free than Balsamiq is. But really great communications tool. So going on from Tennessee's talk where he's talking about, like, how do you actually sort of communicate, how do you have this barrier between, you know, you text on them and got agreement and they say, yeah, that's what we want. So a content site, one of the things you'll see with a content site is sitemaps, you know, and information architecture. If someone mentions information architecture, that's more a content kind of site. Most websites are content sites. So if you're say, a web agency like mine and you're building websites, chances are you're building content sites. So another way to think about, you know, the difference between, you know, what kind of tool you should use is to think about different roles involved. So in order to explain this, I'm gonna use my heavy weapon, which is figurines. I think figurines are a great way to explain any concept. So if you think about three non-technical kind of roles that a CMS is designed to handle, this is from a CMS point of view, right? A CMS is all about having different interfaces for these different people and letting them do their job well. So you have content editors, site admins, and reviewers. Reviewers are people who don't necessarily edit the content themselves or create the content, but they're people who use the workflow to give authorization for it to go live. They're probably the least technical. Site admins might set permissions and workflow policies. And content editors are people writing the actual pages and titles and to some extent doing the navigation structure a little bit. Now you might have an integrator. An integrator is someone who is somewhat technical. They should, depending on the CMS. Some CMSs mean you have to be very technical to bring all the plugins together and make it all work. Then you've got a front-end developer or a themer. And then you've got someone who knows the whole framework inside out and can write plugins and can pretty much do anything they want with a CMS or with a framework. So if you're a developer, say, and you're reasonably technical and you're just building something for yourself, say you're let's say you're an integrator, content writer, one thing you could use is static site generation. It's becoming very popular with exactly that kind of community. It's not something that you can give to someone who's non-technical that often and say, go and build your blog this way. But for someone who's technical, it's a great solution because it's really lightweight and incredibly easy to host because all it does is generate HTML. So if you're an app, like we talked about before, an app or a startup, the thing about an app or a startup is you want complete control. You want the ability to move buttons left, right, and center all over the page, and you want your interaction to be very, very under your control. And you don't necessarily have a lot of content. You might consider, say, Facebook, they have a lot of content, but in actual fact, Facebook's content is user-generated content, and you're not generating that as part of your development process. So you've got a very technical team on board who want complete control. What you want is a framework. So a simple blog, you might have a content editor, and then you're going to pull from the cloud, you're going to pull your plugins, and you're going to pull your themes perhaps, and maybe not even customize the theme, you're just going to use an off-the-shelf, WordPress themes, for instance. And you may have the whole thing cloud hosted, maybe like WordPress.com or something. So large content site, this is where you really need all these different roles at play, right? You're a large organization. Imagine you're like a government department, like the Victorian SES, for instance. They've got reviewers. They don't let certain things go live. They've got, they're doing a little bit of integration. They're doing the theme themselves, so they've got sort of a front-end people there. And they're also using plugins and everything that they're getting out of the cloud. So that's where you really need what's called an enterprise CMS. When you're starting to talk about like complicated workflows and permission structures, that's what you need. So if you're a web consultancy like mine, you'll tend to have some technical people on board. You may do your own development of plugins, you may not. But what you're doing is you're building sites again and again and again, and you're handing those over to other people who are non-technical. So that's really a CMS. But you can also, if you're doing something appy, maybe you want to use a framework in that case. A lot of consultancies will, I know quite a few Plone consultancies that do Plone and Django, or Drupal and Django, or combinations of different CMSs and a lightweight framework. So one of the problems with CMSs, I think, is this idea of estimating effort and knowing whether you've gone too far with the wrong tool. Because if you've got a framework, your effort is kind of linear. You start with very little functionality, and you might use a few plugins, but generally, you're just going to build most things from scratch because you're building a custom unique app. Now, CMS, to get those a certain number of features, it might be really easy. You get a lot out of the box. But then you hit this point at which you're trying to customize far too much. You're fighting the framework. And at which point, if you'd started with a framework that gave you that flexibility from the beginning, then you probably would have spent less effort. The hardest thing about this, though, is it's not always easy to work out at the beginning. It's obscured, and this can be solved by understanding the framework really, really well. Unfortunately, big frameworks like CMSs are actually really hard to understand, so really good, again, for a web consultancy. If you're just starting out, maybe you're better off with a framework. So this kind of summarizes that to some extent. So the converse of this customization list is you might end up reinventing the wheel. For instance, if you start making something that allows your people to edit content, you're building your own CMS, and you may be spending a lot of effort, and you can get something that is secure and well supported off the shelf with an off-the-shelf CMS. So micro frameworks, I'm just going to skip this. Basically, the idea is that I think it's less important of a difference these days. You know, Django, you can get rid of the ORM if you want. If you know a framework already, stick to the framework that you're working with. And I want to talk a little bit about the ideas of what happens if you need something that's mainly content with a bit of an app, or something that has, as mainly an app, but you've got like this section of it, like which is a help section, and it's got lots of content. So what are the options for sort of combining the two things? So one of the simplest option is you can just have different domains, or use your URL rewrites, and just theme the two things to look kind of similar. You know, this is used a lot for, say, blogs. People might have a WordPress blog associated with their app, and you'll see a lot of times they're just changing the domain name, and it looks kind of similar. The downside on that one is obviously your navigation structure has to, if you change in one part, then you have to go and copy it across and retheme the other thing to have the same navigation structure. So iframes is another option. That's actually what we did with this site for various reasons that were out of control. The bottom section there is using iframes. Ajax is very similar. What's going on here is that the request goes to your CMS, back to the browser, then the browser makes subsequent calls. Ajax, you combine it together with JavaScript, or iframes is just another web call. One thing you can do is you can use the underlying CMS to build, say, a plugin like a content type or something like that. So that's what we did in this example, because it was mainly a content site, and we just wanted one section which was kind of appy. A lot of people get stuck by trying to reuse stuff that's already out there. So what I think people should do more is they should try and use the underlying framework. So if you're using Django CMS, obviously it's a no-brainer that you use Django. Not everyone in the Plone world tries to go back to the bare framework underneath. They should do that more often, I think. You can use things like, in this case, we used what would be considered a framework on top of Plone itself. I won't go into that. Proxying is not, you can do it, it's not such a great idea. That's what they actually do on this site. This wasn't done by us. But one problem with this is that your CMS is sitting there waiting for this backend request to finish, and if your CMS has heavy threads, if it's got like thread local storage, for instance, then you're limiting your capability to serve requests. Edge site includes is another interesting area that's probably not used that much. So the idea of an edge site include is you put a little syntax into your HTML, then use something like Nginx or Varnish will look at that edge site include and say, okay, actually there's another bit I have to get. They go and get that other bit and stick it in. We've developed some extra WSGI middleware to do this in a more complicated way, because standard edge site includes wouldn't let you, for instance, proxy a post request. We've written WSGI middleware that at this point here will store the post data, and if it actually has this another extra special syntax, it will repost that post request here to the external app and send the whole lot back. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to use all the security and in, say, the CMS to say, well, you're allowed to view this page or you're allowed to view this app, and then have that still be used. So my summary is that CMS is good for content if you want a content site. It's good if you have to hand your site over to non-technical people. And that's where I think some framework people go wrong. They don't really think about what happens after they've built the site. Frameworks are good for unique apps. CMS is good for unique apps and content with some kind of combination. But really, if you know what you're doing. But really, anything can do anything if you know what you're doing. The more complex frameworks, the harder it is to know what you're doing. I think that's one of the big lessons. But trust me, I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing. And we're hiring if you also know what you're doing. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions if someone wants to hold their hand up. Yes, hi, I'm Andrew from Australian Statistics, and we have a problem in our site that we want to expose our data from a dynamic database, at the same time make the data available for Google searching.
Yep.
So how would you sort of, at the same time, get dynamic data which can be available through a query, but let Google search it?
There's a couple of ways to do it. Like one is to use the lightweight framework to make bunches of pages that have all the data on it. So obviously, if you've got like, a database that has thousands and thousands of pages, you're going to have to pay the price of Google trying to crawl all of it, and that is not so good. So here's an example where we deliberately design the pages so they can be crawled. It goes in, this is a specialized thing for, it uploads all the timetabling information only for school routes in New South Wales, and displays, so you can get a personalized page and routes for the particular schools. And what we did is we developed a custom content type or database for that, and allowed Google to crawl all that, so that if you type North Sydney boys, then it's going to come up. I'm not sure if there are actual more specific like APIs that you can use to sort of say here's an app type thing, and get Google to crawl it. Pretty much it's got to be crawlable by the web to make it indexable by Google. So.
Hi, I was wondering, when you get a CMS, you basically get a gigantic bucket of tools. Is there like a business load in getting too much for free?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the biggest thing, that people will go, actually this is mostly what I want. It's 90% what I want. All I got to do is customize it, and if you don't, you'll find out the limitations as you go through it. There's this, psychological thing, the paradox of choice. If you have too many choices, you have this sort of, you can become paralyzed, and you can have an unhappy experience because you don't really have enough information or enough knowledge to know which is the right choice. And people will often choose not to choose, even though it's not to their advantage. They could just pick randomly and they'd be better off. And I think that happens in software a lot, and that's part of the reason why lighter weight frameworks are popular. It's kind of easier to basically sit down and say, I know what I'm getting, I know what I have to build, it's predictable, I don't have to choose. So.
Dylan, as appreciation for your talk, here is a packet of the Norwegian Blue roast of the coffee that was served today, and a PyCon Australia mug to drink it from. Please join me in thanking Dylan J.
Thank you.